I didn't think we'd be in phase 3 so early, but here we are. Just this Sunday, one of the biggest economic deals of the century just came to an end. The long-standing petrodollar agreement between Saudi Arabia and the US just expired on June 9th, 2024. Now this system, which has been in place for 75 years, marks a huge shift in global economics. So in today's video, I want to help explain exactly what's happening, why it's happening, and how this will affect us and our future generations. So with that said, let's get into it. Hi, my name is Andrei Jikh. Hope you're doing well. Come for the finance and stay for another boring macroeconomics video, phase 2. So initiate the storytelling and dramatic music. So when most people think about global trade, they're probably thinking about commodities. And when they think about commodities, they're mostly thinking of things like corn or wheat. But there's one commodity to rule them all, and that is oil. Now at the center of this intricate web of global finance, the petrodollar system is at its core. That's why when most people around the world think about what money actually is, they're probably thinking about the US dollar. But it wasn't always like that though. Between 1720 to 1815, if you asked someone to name a currency, they would have probably said the French livre, because it was France that held the reserve status from 1720 to 1815. But then, if you asked someone to name a currency between 1815 to 1920, you would have probably heard the British pound. Now, after World War II, everything changed with the creation of the Bretton Woods Agreement, because after that point, most people would have probably said the US dollar. Now this happened because the US was pretty much the only standing superpower after World War II. But this system wasn't about one thing. It wasn't about commodities. It was about cementing the dollar's role as the world reserve currency. Because being the one money to rule them all gave that country access to two specific superpowers. And one of them was economic stability. Stability allows for things like international trade to happen. If you want countries to trade, you need a common value and a common money that everyone agrees to. And the second superpower is the country whose currency becomes the one benefits from rising asset prices, including treasury bonds, which is seen as safe. So countries park their wealth into money that is seen as stable to preserve their wealth against inflation and all the other currencies. That's why countries like Japan, China, and the UK are some of the biggest holders of US assets through foreign exchange reserves, roughly $7 to $8 trillion worth. But then in secret, another superpower was made for the US dollar, and that was the ability to control the world's energy.
The standard of living of all Americans can be traced back to here, the vast oil-rich deserts of Saudi Arabia.
Our house is your house.
There's an Arab saying, the sands are blowing. And I submit to you, King Fahd, that if the sands of time give us any hint of the future, it is that in the days ahead, the friendship between the Saudi Arabian and American people will be a strong and vital force in the world.
Now after the dollar got off the gold standard, it became the super petrodollar, and it replaced gold by what some people like to call black gold, aka oil. Now how this happened is one of the most interesting stories that has ever happened throughout history.
The petrodollar is actually a device invented by Kissinger and Nixon.
US President Richard Nixon sent his Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger to Saudi Arabia for a secret meeting.
That meeting took place on a battleship called the USS Quincy, and very few records were kept of that meeting. But Roosevelt promised the King of Saudi Arabia weapons and protection in exchange for the United States to have the exclusive right to develop oil from Saudi Arabia using dollars. Meaning, if countries wanted to trade the most important commodity of all, oil, they needed to get their hands on dollars. And from that point on, oil would be priced in USD. And if a country tried to get their hands on oil without using dollars, that country historically needed more freedom in their lives. And it's this arrangement between the US and Saudi Arabia that helps the US with dominance over global trade and helping preserve the US dollar as the world's reserve currency for over 75 years now. But just this Sunday, the Prince of Saudi Arabia announced that he would not renew this contract. And this decision is part of a much bigger trend where countries are ditching dollars in international trade and oil transactions.
The dollar. Looks like they're dumping it.
The world's largest oil producer, Saudi Arabia, is reportedly asking to join BRICS.
As more and more developing nations, including some of the world's largest economies, decide to ditch the dollar in their bilateral trade, voices of concern and even despair are being heard in the US over the looming end of America's global financial dominance.
But the question is, what does all of this actually mean? Ask yourself this question. What is the US famous for exporting that the world is buying? I'll give you some examples. China is famous for being the world's factory. It makes and exports everything. Germany is known for its engineering and high-quality manufacturing. BMW, Porsche, Mercedes. Japan is a major exporter of electronics, cars, Toyota, Honda, and the best anime in the world. South Korea, famous for semiconductors, smartphones, Samsung, Hyundai, Kia, and some of the best skincare products in the world. Saudi Arabia, famous for its oil. It's one of the biggest exporters of crude oil in the world. Russia, famous for its natural resources, its gas, its oil, its coal, its other minerals. Brazil is known for its agriculture, one of the biggest exporters of soybeans, coffee, sugar, and beef. India is a major exporter of software services, tech, and pharmaceuticals. Australia is also rich in natural resources. It's the leading exporter of iron ore, coal, natural gas, and black opal. Canada is also a huge exporter of natural resources, including timber, minerals, and some of the nicest people I've ever met. France is arguably the biggest exporter of luxury goods and fashion in the entire world. Italy is also known for fashion and luxury. Ferrari, Lamborghini, wine, pasta. The Netherlands, famous for happiness, flowers, dairy products, vegetables, height. Switzerland, famous for financial services. It's the world's biggest bank. Pharmaceuticals, Rolex. The United States, famous for the Kardashians. Hollywood. Now, there's actually a lot of things the US produces that the world consumes, including culture, but also tech. We've made the biggest companies in the world. We export the biggest military in the world, but arguably the biggest export that the United States has by far are US dollars. We aid a lot of countries with a lot of money. By design, we are the world's biggest money exports. So the question is, how does being able to export dollars help the US economy? And the answer is, it helps in every single way imaginable. Because having the petrodollar system has created a demand around the world for other countries to buy our dollars and our treasury bonds, because that's how the US fuels its growth, by issuing this debt, these treasury bonds that other people buy. It's also created a stable economy, lower interest rates, and liquidity in financial markets. And this has been hugely beneficial for the US stock market through higher stock prices and investment flows. Without the ability to export dollars, that would mean bad things. Let me show you an analogy using a balloon, because this is the US economy in its normal state. And whenever there's a problem, we can just pump the balloon full of money to solve the problem, which also creates inflation, and it looks like this. Now, if I pump this balloon with enough inflation, eventually those rising prices would cause the economy to break because consumers wouldn't be able to afford anything. So eventually, with enough air, with enough money, the economy would break. Now, lucky for us, we have an exit valve right here. That means we can release the pressure and the dollars to the rest of the world, and the world would actually absorb it because it also needs those dollars to buy its energy. But what happens when you have a balloon that keeps on expanding and doesn't have an exit valve? Eventually, that balloon would pop. Now that's just an analogy, but what does it really mean? Believe it or not, we've seen what it means because it's happened to other countries.
Greece is on the verge of default tonight, hours from what many believe is a near certainty.
Scenes like this are playing out across the country.
The UN says food prices tripled last year and estimates 4 in 5 Syrians now live below the poverty line.
Since 2019, the Lebanese pound has lost more than 90% of its value.
Basic commodity prices have almost doubled.
Argentina's annual inflation reached more than 100% in February. This is the first time since 1991 it's been in triple digits.
So his costs go up whenever the value of the South Sudanese pound falls against the US dollar.
Higher inflation means higher interest rates to fight inflation, and higher interest rates also means it's more expensive to borrow money, which means expensive mortgages and rents, more expensive auto loans, higher student loans, and higher interest rates on credit cards. Higher interest rates also puts a strain on the banking system, which we've seen with the smaller bank failures. It puts a strain on the national deficit, which we've also seen, and of course the federal budget, which also means in order to fight that, we might have to raise our taxes to pay for those higher interest payments. Another problem would be the value of the dollar itself would be affected because it would no longer be needed by other countries. That makes traveling overseas a lot more expensive. It makes buying things that are made in other countries more expensive. And it becomes harder to retire because those retirement accounts, those IRAs and 401ks would be negatively affected. Remember, less foreign dollars buying assets equals slower growth. Question is, why is Saudi Arabia doing this? Some people blame US leadership and Congress for creating the situation. Some people say they're doing this because they can, because it makes sense for a country to trade how they choose and to sell their assets in the currency they want. But it's also because of their commitment to the BRICS alliance. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Countries like China and Russia, for example, have been reducing their dependence on the dollar for a while now, which is why China recently dumped a bunch of US Treasury bonds. And it's also why the dollar as a reserve currency has reached a 14-year low. So how can the US fight this then? Now, short of declaring freedom on a country, the US can also raise its federal fund rate, or the interest rate, to attract more money to be parked here. And we have. But the US can only raise the interest rate so far before it starts to affect the US economy, consumers, small banks, and the ability for us to borrow money. So unfortunately, there's really not a lot the US can do, which doesn't sound like good news, but I also want to show you data that argues the effects of all of this. I did this in another video, but if you didn't watch that video, I think it's important to remind yourself just how powerful the US's #1 export still actually is. Because the world holds roughly 59% of its foreign exchange reserves in dollars, in comparison to only 20% of that in euros and only 3% for the Chinese renminbi. And the dollar is used in 88% of foreign exchange transactions according to the Atlantic Council. And for the Chinese yuan, which a lot of people reference as a competitor to the dollar, just had 73 central banks abandon it in favor for buying more gold and US dollars. In fact, in a survey of global money managers, when they were asked what they wanted to do over the next 1 to 2 years with their currency, here's what they said. 18% of them said they would be adding to their US dollar, which is 3 times higher than what it was last year. And the dollar is also backed by the world's biggest, most advanced, and powerful militaries in the entire world. Now, how long that's going to last is not something I can answer. All I've shown you is just the data and the facts about what's really going on today. So I don't know, none of this was my opinion, but if you made it this far, here's what I personally think. I didn't even know this agreement was coming to an end until a couple days ago when someone left a comment on my video, so thank you for bringing it to my attention. I do read and respond to a lot of your comments, but I'll reiterate what I said in that video. The world has been becoming less dependent on the dollar for a long time now, and it makes perfect sense why it would want that for itself to me. But it's been happening extremely slowly. And I can see in my lifetime how the dollar will continue to play less of a central role in global trade. But do I think it's going to be replaced by another currency? Not in my lifetime, even with this agreement coming to an end. Now, rather than just saving my money and worrying about the end of the world, about something that is completely outside of my control, I focus on what I can control, which is just investing into the stock market, into low-cost broad market index funds, and reinvesting all of my dividend income back into my dividend stocks. And as an insurance policy, I also like to buy some Bitcoin. Now, I don't think that Bitcoin will ever become a currency, but Bitcoin has what I like to call a lot of attack vectors for preserving and creating wealth. For example, I think the generational wealth transfer from our parents alone will make Bitcoin outgrow the size of gold. I think we'll see more countries with high inflation adopt the Bitcoin standard. We'll see more pension funds join Bitcoin. It'll be added to mutual funds inside of people's retirement accounts like 401ks and IRAs. I think Bitcoin will eventually become a world reserve asset, a store of value, especially for currencies that get printed out of thin air. Now, it's not just a hedge against the dollar, it's also a hedge or a bet against any other currency that may or may not replace it. Now, I also hold some real estate because they can't print more of that. I have some stocks, I have some bonds, I have some dividend stocks as well. Now, if I'm wrong on any one of them, which I could be, hopefully if I'm right somewhere else, then I'll be all right. That's just my approach. With that, there's a lot of risk and of course mistakes which are made public, but I still hope that you get some value and insight anyway. I'd love to hear what you think and what you're doing. Let me know what I might have missed. As always, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Smash the like button, subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to grab your free stocks. Links are down below and then go track them automatically with the spreadsheet link down below in my Patreon. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'd love to see you back here on Monday and Friday, sometimes a Wednesday. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.